The first rays of sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long golden streaks across the polished marble floors. Queen Camilla stood in her private chambers, adjusting her pearl necklace with practiced precision. The morning routine had become second nature to her over the years, but today felt different. There was a tension in her shoulders that she couldn't shake, a restless energy that had kept her awake for most of the night. The previous evening's state dinner had been a disaster, though she was certain that none of the guests had noticed the subtle signs of disrespect that had plagued the entire event. Staff members had been slower to respond to her requests, their bows seemed less deep, and she had caught several of them exchanging glances when they thought she wasn't looking. It was the kind of thing that most people would dismiss as paranoia, but Queen Camilla had learned to read the subtle language of royal protocol like others read books. She walked to her window overlooking the East Terrace garden, her silk dress rustling softly with each step. The gardens were immaculate as always, with every hedge trimmed to perfection and every flower bed arranged with mathematical precision. This was her domain, a place where order and hierarchy were not just expected, but enforced through generations of tradition. Yet even here, in this sanctuary of royal authority, she felt the creeping sensation that her position was not as secure as it should be. The truth was that Queen Camilla had always felt the need to prove herself more than other members of the royal family. Her path to the throne had been unconventional, marked by public scrutiny and media attention that had not always been favorable. She had worked tirelessly to earn her place in the institution, but the effort had left her hypervigilant about any sign that her authority might be questioned or undermined. As she made her way through the corridors toward the gardens, she reflected on the conversations she had overheard in recent weeks. The palace staff, who had once spoken to her with the same reverence they showed other senior royals, now seemed to measure their words more carefully. There was a formality in their interactions that felt forced, as if they were going through the motions of respect rather than genuinely feeling it. The morning air was crisp and clean as she stepped outside, her heels clicking rhythmically against the stone pathways that wound through the carefully manicured landscape. She had always found the gardens soothing, but today they felt more like a stage where her authority would either be reinforced or further eroded. Every groundskeeper who nodded in her direction, every gardener who stepped aside to let her pass, became a small test of her influence within the palace hierarchy. Queen Camilla paused near a fountain where water cascaded gently over carved stone angels, their faces serene and timeless. She remembered the first time she had walked through these gardens as a member of the royal family. How overwhelming it had felt to suddenly be responsible for maintaining traditions that stretched back hundreds of years. The weight of that responsibility had never fully left her shoulders, and lately, it seemed to be growing heavier rather than lighter. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on gravel. A young woman in a crisp palace uniform approached with a silver tray containing the morning correspondence. The girl curtsied appropriately, but Queen Camilla noticed that her eyes didn't quite meet hers during the exchange. It was a small thing, barely worth mentioning, but it added to the growing collection of minor slights that had been accumulating in her mind. "Thank you," Queen Camilla said, accepting the letters with what she hoped was an appropriately regal tone. The girl nodded and retreated, but not before Queen Camilla caught the slight hesitation in her step, as if she had wanted to say something, but thought better of it. The correspondence was the usual mixture of official business and social obligations, but Queen Camilla found herself unable to concentrate on any of it. Her attention kept drifting to the various staff members who moved through the gardens around her, each one a potential source of the disrespect she felt but couldn't quite prove. There were groundskeepers tending to rosebushes maintenance, workers checking the fountain mechanisms, and security personnel making their routine patrols. It was during this scan of the garden activities that her eyes fell upon a figure that made her pause. Near the eastern wall, where the morning shadows were just beginning to retreat, stood a guard in full ceremonial uniform. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of military training and professional discipline. His name tag, visible even from her distance, read Williams. Queen Camilla had noticed Guard Williams before, during various royal events and ceremonies. There was something about him that had always caught her attention, though she had never been able to articulate exactly what it was. He performed his duties flawlessly, maintained perfect protocol, and had never given her any concrete reason to question his service. Yet something in his demeanor had always struck her as different from the other guards. Perhaps it was the way he held his head, the confidence that seemed to go beyond mere professional competence. Or maybe it was the look in his eyes during the brief moments when protocol required him to make eye contact with members of the royal family. While other guards showed the appropriate deference mixed with what she interpreted as genuine awe at being in the presence of royalty, Williams displayed something that looked more like professional respect, tinged with quiet assessment. Today, as she watched him from across the garden, Queen Camilla felt her frustration crystallizing into something more focused. Here was a target for her growing need to reassert her authority, someone whose subtle lack of proper submissiveness she could address directly and publicly. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Guard Williams represented everything that was wrong with the current atmosphere in the palace. She began walking toward him with purposeful strides, her mind already formulating the conversation that would put him in his place and send a clear message to anyone who might be watching. This would be her opportunity to demonstrate that respect for the royal family was not optional, and that even the smallest signs of insubordination would be addressed swiftly and decisively. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as Queen Camilla approached Guard Williams, unaware that she was about to initiate a confrontation that would fundamentally alter how she was perceived by everyone who witnessed it. In her determination to assert her authority, she was walking directly into a situation that would reveal more about her own character than about the young man she intended to discipline. Guard Williams remained at attention, unaware of the approaching storm, his focus maintained on his duties as a protector of the crown and all it represented. The contrast between his calm professionalism and Queen Camilla's brewing agitation would soon become apparent to everyone present, setting the stage for a confrontation that would be remembered and discussed in palace circles for years to come. The distance between Queen Camilla and Guard Williams seemed to shrink with each determined step she took across the manicured lawn. Her silk dress rustled against the morning breeze, and her jewelry caught the sunlight as she moved with the kind of purposeful grace that had been drilled into her through years of public appearances. But beneath the polished exterior, her thoughts were racing with anticipation of the confrontation she was about to initiate. Guard Williams stood perfectly still near the rose garden, his uniform immaculate and his posture reflecting the discipline of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. He had been assigned to this particular section of the castle grounds for the past 6 months, and he knew every inch of the area he was responsible for protecting. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but he had no way of knowing that he was about to become the focal point of Queen Camilla's need to reassert her authority within the palace hierarchy. As Queen Camilla drew closer, she could see the details of his uniform more clearly. Every button was polished to a mirror finish. Every crease in his clothing was sharp and precise, and his boots reflected the morning sun like black glass. His weapon was properly secured, his communication equipment was positioned correctly, and his overall appearance was beyond reproach. If she was going to find fault with him, it would have to be based on something more subtle than his adherence to dress code and protocol. "Guard Williams," she called out when she was still several paces away, her voice carrying the authoritative tone that she had practiced in countless official functions. The sound cut through the peaceful morning air like a blade, and several other people in the vicinity turned their heads to see what was happening. Williams responded immediately, turning toward her with the fluid motion of someone whose military training had become second nature. He executed a perfect about-face and offered the appropriate bow, his movements crisp and professional. "Your Majesty," he replied, his voice respectful and measured, giving no indication that he sensed the tension that Queen Camilla was bringing to the encounter. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. The height difference was something she hadn't fully considered, and it made her feel momentarily at a disadvantage. She compensated by straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin in a gesture that she hoped conveyed the proper sense of royal authority. "I've been observing the guards recently," she began, her words carefully chosen to establish the premise for her criticism. "And I must say, I'm not entirely pleased with what I see. There seems to be a lack of proper respect and attention to detail that I find quite concerning." Williams maintained his professional posture, his eyes focused at a point just over her shoulder, as protocol demanded. He said nothing, which was appropriate for a subordinate being addressed by a member of the royal family. But Queen Camilla interpreted his silence as evidence of the disrespectful attitude she was determined to address. She began to walk slowly around him, her heels clicking against the stone pathway that bordered the rose beds. The movement was calculated to make him feel scrutinized and uncomfortable, a technique she had observed other authority figures use when they wanted to establish dominance in a situation. "Tell me, Williams, how long have you been serving in the Royal Guard?" "3 years, Your Majesty," he replied, without hesitation, his voice steady and clear. The answer was straightforward and factual, but Queen Camilla was listening for undertones of defensiveness or nervousness that she could interpret as signs of guilt or insubordination. 3 years, she repeated, allowing a note of skepticism to enter her voice. "And in those 3 years, has anyone ever explained to you the importance of showing proper deference to members of the royal family?" The question was designed to be insulting, implying that his behavior had been inappropriate and that he needed to be educated about basic protocol. She paused in her circling to stand directly in front of him again, watching his face for any sign of the reaction she was trying to provoke. By this time, several other people in the garden had begun to take notice of the interaction. A pair of groundskeepers working nearby had slowed their activities to observe what was happening, and a housekeeping supervisor who had been walking toward the castle had stopped to watch from a respectful distance. The growing audience was exactly what Queen Camilla wanted, as she intended this conversation to serve as an example to anyone who might be harboring similar disrespectful attitudes. Williams took a moment before responding, and Queen Camilla interpreted the pause as evidence that he was struggling to come up with an appropriate defense for his behavior. In reality, he was simply processing the unexpected nature of the confrontation and trying to understand what had prompted it. His service record was exemplary. He had never received any complaints about his conduct, and he genuinely could not think of any incident that might have led to this public dressing down. "Yes, Your Majesty," he finally replied, his tone remaining respectful despite the increasingly hostile nature of the questioning. "I believe I understand the protocols quite well." There was something in his response that Queen Camilla found infuriating. Though she would have been hard-pressed to articulate exactly what it was, the words themselves were perfectly appropriate, but she detected what she interpreted as a subtle challenge to her authority. The phrase, "I believe," struck her as unnecessarily tentative, while the confidence in his voice seemed to contradict the humility that his words were supposed to convey. Her face began to redden as her frustration mounted. This was not going according to the script she had imagined, where the guard would immediately recognize his failings and offer an appropriate apology. Instead, she found herself facing someone who seemed completely unaware of having done anything wrong, which only reinforced her conviction that he was exactly the kind of person who needed to be put in his place. "I don't think you do understand, Williams," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge that carried clearly across the garden. "I think you've become far too comfortable in your position. Perhaps you've forgotten that respect isn't just about following orders, it's about recognizing your place in the hierarchy of this institution." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and the small crowd of observers shifted uncomfortably. This was not the kind of interaction that anyone expected to witness in the normally serene environment of the castle gardens. Palace staff were accustomed to the formal but generally respectful relationships between royalty and their employees. And this public confrontation represented a significant departure from established norms. Williams remained silent, as was appropriate for someone being addressed by a member of the royal family, but his continued composure only seemed to further inflame Queen Camilla's anger. She had expected her words to have a more dramatic effect, and his apparent inability to recognize the severity of his situation struck her as further evidence of the disrespectful attitude she was determined to correct. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the garden as the confrontation escalated. What had begun as Queen Camilla's attempt to reassert her authority was rapidly becoming something much more significant. Though she was too focused on her immediate goals to recognize the dangerous territory she was entering, the stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal far more about her character than about the young guard she was attempting to discipline. The tension in the garden had become palpable as Queen Camilla's voice rose above the gentle sounds of fountains and rustling leaves. Her previous attempts to elicit a submissive response from Guard Williams had failed to produce the results she desired, and her frustration was beginning to transform into something more dangerous. The small audience that had gathered at the periphery of the confrontation watched with growing discomfort as they witnessed behavior that seemed increasingly inappropriate for someone of her station. Queen Camilla took a step closer to Williams, invading his personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. Her eyes were bright with anger, and there was a flush in her cheeks that spoke of barely controlled emotion. She had moved beyond the realm of appropriate discipline and was now operating purely on the need to demonstrate her power over someone she perceived as challenging her authority. "I want you to explain to me in front of everyone here," she demanded, gesturing toward the gathered staff members with a sweeping motion of her arm, "why you think your casual attitude is appropriate when dealing with members of the royal family." The demand was unprecedented in its cruelty and its violation of normal palace protocol. Even when discipline was necessary, it was typically handled privately and through proper channels, not as a public spectacle designed to humiliate an employee. In front of their colleagues, the request revealed more about Queen Camilla's state of mind than it did about any actual wrongdoing on Williams' part. The groundskeepers, who had initially paused in their work to observe the interaction, now found themselves unwilling witnesses to what appeared to be a complete breakdown of the dignified behavior expected from members of the royal family. Senior gardener named Thompson, who had worked at the castle for over 15 years, later described the scene as the most uncomfortable moment he had ever experienced during his tenure. The housekeeping supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, stood frozen in place, uncertain whether she should intervene or retreat to avoid becoming involved in the escalating situation. Williams maintained his military bearing despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere, but those watching could see the subtle changes in his posture that indicated he was processing the unprecedented nature of what was happening. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, now showed the slight tension of someone preparing for a difficult situation. Yet his training and professionalism held firm, and he gave no outward sign of the anger or humiliation that Queen Camilla was so obviously trying to provoke. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, his voice still maintaining the respectful tone that protocol required, "I apologize if I have given any impression of disrespect. That was never my intention, and I would welcome the opportunity to understand how I might better serve the crown." His response was perfect in its diplomacy and professionalism, but it had the opposite effect of what he intended. Why Camilla interpreted his continued composure as further evidence of his disrespectful attitude, and his refusal to be humiliated in the way she desired only intensified her anger. She felt that he was making her look foolish in front of the staff, and her need to reassert control became desperate. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," she snapped, her voice now loud enough to be heard clearly across the entire garden. "Your tone, your attitude, the way you stand there, as if you have nothing to apologize for. You act as if you're somehow equal to members of this family, as if your opinion matters in this institution." The accusation was so far removed from reality that even the observing staff members began to exchange glances of concern and confusion. Williams had shown nothing but perfect respect and professionalism throughout the entire encounter, and his attempts to diffuse the situation with appropriate responses had been twisted into evidence of disrespect by Queen Camilla's increasingly irrational interpretation of his behavior. By now, word of the confrontation had begun to spread through the castle's communication networks in the way that dramatic events always did in close-knit communities. Staff members who had heard fragments of raised voices were making excuses to pass through the garden area, and the crowd of witnesses was growing steadily larger. Among the newcomers was Sir James Morrison, the deputy private secretary, who had been alerted to the situation by a concerned housekeeping staff member. Morrison arrived just as Queen Camilla was launching into another tirade about the declining standards of respect within the palace. He positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid becoming directly involved in what was clearly a situation that had spiraled far beyond appropriate bounds. His presence added another layer of significance to the confrontation. His eventual report would likely reach the highest levels of the royal household. "I have served this institution faithfully," Williams began. And for the first time since the confrontation started, there was a subtle change in his tone. It was still respectful, still professional, but there was now an underlying strength that had been absent from his previous responses. "I've never shirked my duties, never compromised security, and never acted in a manner that would bring dishonor to the crown." Queen Camilla's eyes widened at what she perceived as outright defiance. The fact that Williams was now speaking without being directly asked a question struck her as the ultimate proof of his disrespectful attitude, even though his words were actually a measured defense of his service record rather than any kind of challenge to her authority. "How dare you speak to me without permission," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that bordered on shrill. "Yeah, this is exactly the kind of insubordination I'm talking about. You think you can just insert yourself into conversations with members of the royal family whenever you feel like defending yourself?" The irony of her statement was not lost on the assembled audience. She had specifically demanded that he explain himself publicly, but now she was criticizing him for doing exactly what she had ordered. The contradiction revealed the extent to which her anger had clouded her judgment and undermined her ability to maintain any semblance of rational authority. Williams stood quietly for a moment, and those watching could see him making a decision about how to respond to this increasingly unreasonable situation. His military training had taught him the importance of chain of command and proper respect for authority, but it had also instilled in him a strong sense of honor and self-respect that was now being directly challenged. The morning sun had reached its full strength, bathing the garden in bright light that seemed to highlight every detail of the confrontation. The roses around them bloomed in perfect splendor, their beauty providing a stark contrast to the ugliness of the scene unfolding among them. The fountains continued their gentle music, but the sound was now overwhelmed by the tension that had transformed this peaceful setting into a stage for confrontation that would be remembered long after the flowers had faded and the seasons had changed, as Queen Camilla prepared to escalate the situation even further. Williams was reaching a point where his patience and professionalism would be tested in ways that his training had never anticipated. The next few moments would determine whether this confrontation would end with her achieving the submission she demanded, or whether her attempt to publicly humiliate a dedicated servant of the crown would instead expose her own character flaws to everyone present. The moment that would define the entire confrontation was approaching as Guard Williams stood in the center of the garden, surrounded by an ever-growing crowd of palace staff who had never witnessed anything quite like this scene before. Camilla's demands for public humiliation had reached a crescendo, and her expectation of immediate submission hung in the air like a challenge that could no longer be ignored or deflected through diplomatic responses. Williams took a deep breath, and something fundamental shifted in his demeanor. The change was subtle but unmistakable to those who were watching closely. His shoulders straightened slightly, not in defiance, but in the quiet confidence of someone who had made a decision to stand by his principles, regardless of the consequences. When he lifted his head to look directly at Queen Camilla, there was a clarity in his eyes that had not been there before. "Your Majesty," he began, and his voice carried a weight that made everyone in the garden stop what they were doing to listen. "I have served this institution faithfully for 3 years. I have protected members of your family with my life, worked 18-hour shifts without complaint, and maintained the highest standards of professional conduct at all times." Queen Camilla opened her mouth to interrupt, but something in his tone made her pause. There was no anger in his voice, no disrespect, but there was an unmistakable strength that commanded attention. For the first time since the confrontation began, she found herself listening rather than simply waiting for her turn to attack. "I have shown respect to every member of the royal family," Williams continued, his words measured and deliberate. Not because of their titles, but because of their service to the crown and to the people of Britain. I have never once failed in my duties, never once compromised the security or dignity of this institution, and never once acted in a manner that would bring shame upon the royal guard or the uniform I wear. The crowd had grown to include nearly 20 staff members, and among them were several senior palace officials who rarely ventured into the gardens during their daily routines. Sir James Morrison had moved closer, his face grave with concern about the implications of what he was witnessing. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, head of household staff, had arrived and was standing near the fountain with an expression of shocked disbelief at the scene unfolding before her. Williams took a small step back, not in retreat, but to create the proper distance for what he was about to say. His military training had taught him the importance of positioning and presence, and he understood instinctively that this moment required him to demonstrate the dignity that Queen Camilla seemed determined to strip away from him. "If your Majesty believes that respect must be earned through intimidation and public humiliation of staff members," said his voice growing stronger with each word, "then perhaps we have different understandings of what it means to serve the crown with honor." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical force. This was not the response anyone had expected, least of all Queen Camilla herself. She had anticipated tears, apologies, or at worst, angry defiance that would justify whatever punishment she chose to impose. Instead, she found herself facing a young man who spoke with the kind, as a quiet moral authority that comes from absolute certainty in one's principles. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Even the sounds of the garden seemed muted as everyone processed what they had just heard. Williams had not raised his voice, had not shown any disrespect toward Queen Camilla's position, but he had nevertheless delivered what amounted to a devastating critique of her behavior and her understanding of leadership. Queen Camilla's face went through a series of color changes as the implications of his words sank in. She had expected to emerge from this confrontation with her authority reinforced and her position strengthened. Instead, she found herself publicly confronted with a mirror that reflected not the dignity she believed she projected, but the petty tyranny she had actually displayed. "How dare you speak to me in that manner?" she managed to say, but her voice lacked the commanding presence it had held just moments before. The words sounded hollow and weak compared to the quiet strength Williams had demonstrated, and everyone present could hear the difference. Williams bowed respectfully, maintaining the protocols even as he continued to challenge the premises underlying Queen Camilla's behavior. "I apologize if my words have offended your Majesty. That was never my intention. I simply believe that respect flows both ways, and that the members of this family are at their best when they inspire loyalty through their actions rather than demand it through their positions." The contrast between his dignified response and her increasingly shrill demands could not have been more stark. Where she had sought to diminish him, he had maintained his composure. Where she had demanded submission, he had demonstrated strength. Where she had tried to humiliate him publicly, he had instead exposed the weakness in her own approach to leadership. Mrs. Hartwell later described the moment as one of the most extraordinary things she had witnessed in her 30-year career. In royal service, here was a young guard facing potential dismissal and public disgrace, who chose to stand by his principles rather than submit to treatment he knew was wrong. His courage in that moment reflected the very best traditions of service to the crown. Even as Queen Camilla's behavior represented a departure from those same traditions, Sir James Morrison realized that he was witnessing a defining moment not just for the individuals involved, but for the institution they all served. The story of this confrontation would spread through palace circles within hours, and the contrast between the guard's dignified response and Queen Camilla's bullying behavior would become a topic of conversation that would persist for months, or even years. Williams straightened his uniform jacket with a precise movement that somehow conveyed both military discipline and personal pride. "I think," he said quietly, "that we all serve this institution best when we remember that true nobility comes from how we treat those who have no power to strike back. The crown has always been strongest when it has been a symbol of justice, fairness, and honor for all British people, regardless of their station in life. With those words, he had transformed a personal confrontation into a statement about the very nature of royal service and the responsibilities that come with positions of power and privilege. He had reminded everyone present, including Queen Camilla herself, of the ideals that the monarchy was supposed to represent, and he had done so with a grace and dignity that made her previous behavior look even more inappropriate by comparison. The young guard executed one final perfect bow before returning to his assigned position. His movement was fluid and professional, showing no sign of the emotional turmoil that such a confrontation might reasonably have produced. He resumed his duties with the same quiet competence he had always displayed, but something fundamental had changed in the garden that morning. Queen Camilla stood in the center of the pathway, surrounded by staff members who had witnessed her very public failure to command the respect she had demanded. The silence stretched on as everyone struggled to process what they had just experienced, and the implications of what it meant for the future of palace relations became increasingly clear to all involved. The silence that enveloped the garden after Guard Williams returned to his position was unlike anything the assembled staff had ever experienced during their years of palace service. It was not the comfortable quiet of a well-ordered morning routine, but rather the heavy, oppressive silence that follows a moment of profound revelation. Queen Camilla remained standing in the center of the stone pathway, her elaborate outfit and carefully arranged jewelry suddenly seeming out of place in the face of what had just transpired. For the first time since the confrontation began, Queen Camilla looked around at the faces surrounding her with genuine attention rather than the dismissive glances she had been casting while focused on her intended victim. What she saw in those faces sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning breeze. There was no admiration for her display of authority, no appreciation for her attempt to maintain proper standards of respect. Instead, she encountered expressions ranging from embarrassment to disappointment, and in some cases, what appeared to be barely concealed contempt. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeping supervisor who had inadvertently become one of the first witnesses to the confrontation, stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her usual warm demeanor replaced by a look of profound discomfort. She had worked closely with Queen Camilla on numerous occasions over the past several years, coordinating various household arrangements and special events. Never before had she seen behavior from any member of the royal family that made her feel ashamed to be associated with the institution she had served so proudly for decades. Sir James Morrison, whose position required him to maintain strict neutrality in palace affairs, found himself struggling to process the implications of what he had witnessed. As Deputy Private Secretary, he would be expected to file a report on any significant incident involving members of the royal family and their interactions with staff. The challenge he now faced was how to document what had occurred without creating a permanent record of behavior that could prove deeply damaging to the monarchy's reputation if it ever became public knowledge. The groundskeepers who had first noticed the confrontation were now pretending to be absorbed in their work. But their movements were mechanical and unfocused as they tried to process what they had seen. Thompson, the senior gardener, had been pruning the same rose bush for several minutes without actually cutting anything, his attention completely absorbed by the realization that he had just witnessed a fundamental shift in the palace's internal dynamics. Queen Camilla's mind raced as she tried to understand how the situation had gone so completely wrong. She had entered the garden with a clear objective and what she believed was justified authority to address a problem that had been bothering her for weeks. Instead of achieving the submission and public acknowledgement of her power that she had sought, she found herself in the unprecedented position of being lectured on proper conduct by someone she had intended to discipline. The young guard's words continued to echo in her mind, particularly his observation about respect flowing both ways and his suggestion that true nobility was demonstrated through the treatment of those without power to retaliate. These concepts challenged everything she believed about hierarchy and authority within the royal system. But she could not deny the impact his quiet dignity had made on everyone present. As the minutes passed and the crowd began to disperse, Queen Camilla realized that her attempt to reassert control had instead demonstrated a fundamental lack of the very qualities she claimed to represent. The contrast between her behavior and William's response had created a narrative that would be impossible to control or reshape through later explanations or justifications. Mrs. Hartwell approached cautiously, her expression carefully neutral, but her concern evident in the way she held herself. As head of household staff, she was responsible for maintaining smooth relationships between the royal family and their employees. And she immediately understood that this incident had the potential to create lasting damage to those relationships. "If not handled carefully, Your Majesty," she said softly, "perhaps we should discuss the morning schedule in your private study." The suggestion was tactful and appropriate, offering Queen Camilla a graceful exit from a situation that had become untenable. But even this attempt at diplomatic rescue served to highlight how completely her authority had been undermined. Was now being managed by her own staff, guided away from a confrontation she had initiated but could no longer control. As they walked toward the castle, Queen Camilla caught glimpses of staff members throughout the gardens and corridors, and she realized that word of the incident was already spreading through the palace's informal communication networks. The looks she received were different from the respectful acknowledgments she was accustomed to receiving. There was a new wariness in people's eyes, careful evaluation that suggested they were seeing her in a completely new light. Back in the garden, Guard Williams maintained his professional focus on his duties. But the other staff members found it difficult to return to their normal routines. The confrontation had revealed something about the institution they all served that many of them had never considered before. They had witnessed a moment where the ideals of royal service had been embodied not by a member of the royal family, but by one of their own colleagues. The conversation among the staff began almost immediately, though it was conducted in the hushed tones reserved for discussions of sensitive palace matters. The consensus was remarkable in its unanimity. Guard Williams had conducted himself with exactly the kind of dignity and honor that the royal family was supposed to represent, while Queen Camilla had displayed behavior that was unworthy of her. Position Thompson, the senior gardener, found himself in an unusual position as staff members sought him out for his perspective on what had happened. As one of the longest-serving employees present during the confrontation, his opinion carried particular weight among his colleagues. "I've been working these gardens for 15 years," he told a small group that had gathered near the fountain. "I've seen members of this family at their best and their worst, in public and in private. But I've never seen anything like what happened here this morning." His words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was clear to everyone who heard them. The incident had crossed a line that most of them hadn't even realized existed until they saw it violated so dramatically. Word of the confrontation reached different levels of the palace hierarchy, with varying degrees of detail and interpretation. But the core facts remained consistent across all versions of the story. Queen Camilla had publicly attempted to humiliate a guard who had shown nothing but exemplary service. And her attempt had backfired spectacularly when he responded with a dignity that highlighted her own lack thereof. In the servants' quarters, the conversation took on tones of both admiration for William's courage and concern for his future employment. Many staff members had experienced their own moments of unfair treatment from various members of the royal family over the years, but none had ever seen someone respond with such principled resistance while maintaining complete professionalism. "Could lose his position over this," whispered Sarah, one of the younger housekeeping staff, to her colleague during their afternoon break. "Speaking to her like that, no matter how right he was." "Maybe," replied her friend Margaret, who had worked at the palace for nearly a decade, "but I think what he said needed to be said. Someone had to remind her that wearing a crown doesn't give you the right to treat people like dirt." These conversations, multiplied across dozens of staff members throughout the castle, created an undercurrent of discussion that fundamentally altered the palace's internal atmosphere. For the first time in many of their careers, employees found themselves openly questioning the behavior of a senior member of the royal family. And more surprisingly, finding widespread support for their concerns. Sir James Morrison spent the remainder of the morning wrestling with the question of how to handle the situation officially. His responsibilities included protecting the reputation of the royal family while ensuring that palace operations continued smoothly. The incident in the garden threatened both of these objectives in ways that would require careful navigation. After much consideration, he decided to schedule a private meeting with Queen Camilla for the following day, ostensibly to discuss upcoming official engagements, but actually to address the morning's events and their potential consequences. He hoped that a tactful conversation might help her understand the seriousness of what had occurred and prevent similar incidents in the future. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla herself had retreated to her private chambers, where she spent the remainder of the day in an increasingly agitated state of reflection. The more she thought about the confrontation, the more she realized that her attempt to assert authority had instead revealed her insecurities and undermined her position within the palace hierarchy. The worst part was the growing realization that Guard Williams had been right in his assessment of her behavior. She had used her position to try to humiliate someone who had done nothing wrong. She had done it publicly in a way that violated every principle of fair and dignified leadership. The young man's response had forced her to confront aspects of her character that she had never been willing to acknowledge before. As evening approached and the initial shock of the morning's events began to settle into a more permanent understanding of their significance, it became clear that the confrontation in the garden had created a lasting change in the palace's internal dynamics. Queen Camilla's reputation among the staff had been fundamentally altered, not by any external criticism or media attention, but by her own actions, witnessed by the very people whose respect she most needed to maintain. The irony was not lost on those who reflected on the day's events. In her attempt to demonstrate her authority and demand respect, Queen Camilla had instead shown herself to be unworthy of both. Guard Williams, who had never sought to challenge anyone's authority or position, had emerged as an example of the very qualities that true leadership was supposed to embody. The garden where the confrontation had taken place returned to its usual peaceful state as the sun set. But the impact of what had occurred there would continue to resonate through the palace community for months and years to come. The roses continued to bloom, the fountains continued their gentle music, but the institution they adorned had been forever changed by a few minutes of truth-telling that no amount of royal protocol could undo or erase. The weeks following the garden confrontation brought changes to Windsor Castle that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the rhythms of palace life. The incident had created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate participants, fundamentally altering relationships and perceptions in ways that would prove impossible to reverse through official statements or administrative directives. Guard Williams continued his duties with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his service from the beginning, but his colleagues now regarded him with a mixture of respect and concern that had not existed before. He had become something of a legend among the palace staff. The man who had stood up to royal authority and emerged with his dignity intact. However, everyone understood that his future at the palace remained uncertain, as such acts of principled defiance, regardless of their moral justification, rarely went without consequences in institutional hierarchies. The anticipated repercussions for Williams never materialized in the way that many staff members had expected. Rather than facing immediate dismissal or disciplinary action, he found himself in a curious state of limbo where his superiors seemed uncertain about how to proceed. The reason for this hesitation became clear through conversations that filtered down from the upper levels of palace administration. Sir James Morrison's private meeting with Queen Camilla had not gone according to his carefully planned agenda. When he attempted to address the garden incident with diplomatic language and gentle suggestions for future conduct, he discovered that Queen Camilla was already painfully aware of how badly the situation had reflected on her character and judgment. Rather than being defensive or dismissive, she had listened to his concerns with an attentiveness that surprised him. "I made a terrible mistake that morning," she admitted during their conversation, a level of self-reflection that Morrison had rarely witnessed from any member of the royal family. "That young man showed more dignity in 5 minutes than I displayed in my entire approach to the situation." This acknowledgement, while private, influenced the official response to the incident. Instead of seeking retribution against Williams, Queen Camilla had quietly instructed that his service record should reflect commendation for his professionalism. Under difficult circumstances, it was an unprecedented response that spoke to her genuine recognition of how inappropriate her behavior had been. However, Queen Camilla's personal growth and private acknowledgement of her mistakes could not undo the public nature of the original confrontation. The story had spread throughout the palace community and beyond. Carried by the informal networks that exist in any large institution where people work closely together, each retelling reinforced the contrast between her bullying behavior and William's principled response, creating a narrative that became more damaging with each repetition. The broader implications of the incident extended beyond personal reputations to affect the very culture of the palace. Staff members who had previously accepted without question the absolute authority of royal family members now found themselves evaluating that authority in light of how it was exercised. The confrontation had demonstrated that respect based solely on position and title was fragile, while respect earned through character and conduct proved much more durable. Mrs. Hartwell, in her role as head of household staff, noticed significant changes in how employees interacted with various members of the royal family. There was a new wariness in their approach to Queen Camilla, careful professionalism that lacked the warmth and genuine affection that characterized their relationships with other royals. Staff members fulfilled their duties impeccably, but the enthusiasm and personal investment that had previously characterized their service had been replaced by a more measured approach. "It's not that they're disrespectful," Mrs. Hartwell explained to a colleague during one of their regular administrative meetings. "It's that they're protecting themselves now. They've seen what can happen when someone in authority decides to abuse their position, and they're making sure they don't become targets themselves." This change in staff dynamics had practical consequences for palace operations. The informal networks of communication and cooperation that had previously made the household run smoothly became more cautious and formal. Staff members were less likely to go above and beyond their specific duties when working on projects associated with Queen Camilla, not out of deliberate sabotage, but out of a natural human tendency to minimize exposure to unpredictable authority figures. The incident also had implications beyond the immediate palace community. Stories of royal behavior, even private ones, have a way of reaching broader circles through the extended networks of friends, family, and former colleagues that connect palace employees to the outside world. Within months, whispered accounts of the confrontation had reached social circles in London, where they were discussed with the kind of fascination that such stories always generate. These conversations took on particular significance because they contrasted so sharply with the public image that Queen Camilla had worked so hard to cultivate since joining the royal family. Her efforts to be seen as a dignified and compassionate figure were undermined by accounts of her attempting to publicly humiliate a dedicated employee for no apparent reason other than her own insecurity. Guard Williams, meanwhile, had unknowingly become a symbol of something larger than the specific incident in the garden. His response to Queen Camilla's bullying had demonstrated qualities that many people felt were missing from contemporary leadership at all levels of society. In an age when authority figures often seem to abuse their positions with impunity, his quiet insistence on dignity and mutual respect resonated with people far beyond the palace walls. The long-term impact on Queen Camilla's standing within the royal family itself was perhaps the most significant consequence of all. Other family members, while never discussing the incident directly, were undoubtedly aware of what had occurred and its implications for the institution they all represented. The monarchy's strength had always depended on maintaining public respect and confidence, and incidents that revealed character flaws or poor judgment threatened that foundation. Years later, palace historians would mark the garden confrontation as a turning point in understanding how power and authority function within modern royal institutions. The incident demonstrated that even in highly hierarchical organizations, moral authority ultimately trumps positional authority when the two come into conflict. William's dignified response had reminded everyone present of the values that institutions are supposed to serve, while Queen Camilla's behavior had shown how easily those values can be compromised by personal insecurity and the abuse of power. The roses in the East Terrace garden continued to bloom each season, tended by Thompson and his colleagues with the same care they had always received. But the garden would forever be remembered by those who worked there as the place where a young guard had demonstrated that true nobility comes not from titles or positions, but from how one chooses to conduct oneself when faced with injustice or unreasonable authority. The confrontation had lasted only minutes, but its consequences would endure for years, serving as a reminder that respect cannot be demanded or imposed, but must be earned through character and conduct worthy of the positions we hold and the people we serve.